you so much, Julie, for having me. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Shabbat Shalom. It's really exciting to learn Torah together, as always. This is such a good parasha, Parashat Beha'alotcha, which is the third parasha in the book of Numbers. Just as a note, I don't know if other teachers have been mentioning this, but in the diaspora, we are on a slightly different schedule, or maybe I should put it a little bit differently. Currently, the Jewish world is on a, maybe we could call it a dual parasha schedule. Those of us who are outside of Israel are reading Beha'alotcha this week, and those who are in Israel are reading Shlach Lecha this week. That has to do with how Pesach fell out this year, which feels really appropriate given what we're going to be talking about today. But be that as it may, we are focusing on Parashat Beha'alotcha. And Parashat Beha'alotcha is the third parasha in the book of Numbers in Sefer Bamidbar, which is one of my favorite starim in the Torah. There's a lot here. And this parasha in particular has a lot of different episodes that occur throughout it. We could have gone in any number of directions today. And I wanted to begin by giving a summary of the parasha, and then we will zoom in, pardon the pun, on the part of the parasha that we will be focusing on today, because there is no way that we could have covered the entire portion. Please read it on your own. It's fantastic. There are some very famous episodes in the parasha. So we begin the parasha with a very lengthy description in Numbers 8 of the purification of the Levites. And the reason our parasha is called Beha'alotcha is because it has to do with when you go up to light the lamps of the menorah in the Mishkan. That is how our parasha begins, with Aharon being instructed about that. Then we go into a longer conversation about the purification of the Levites. And that is then followed by a conversation about Pesach Sheni, which is what we will be focusing on today. That is then followed by a conversation or a description of how Bnei Yisrael moved camp by camp through the wilderness, which is then followed by a very famous story. There's several stories, I guess you could call it, in Numbers 11 of the people complaining and wanting meat, and Moshe being very frustrated with the people for their reaction and for their attitude. And it ends up being the case that God gives them so much quail that they're eating quail for days and days and days, which God says, I'm going to give you so much quail, it's going to be loathsome to you. The people are saying, we want all the things we had, the fish and the leeks and the onions and the garlic and the cucumbers. Why are we only getting this manna from heaven, this manna from heaven? Why is this the only thing we have? They cry out for food, and Moses is very frustrated and says to Hashem, like, who are these people? Did I give birth to them that you're requiring me to deal with them from day one until now? I mean, I just can't take this. So Moses really hits rock bottom. There's a lot of interesting commentary on that this year that I've come across. We're not going to be focusing on that, but that is a very important part of our parasha. And then we end with very famous story of Miriam and Aharon, who speak against Zipporah, Moshe's wife. There's a lot of interesting commentary about that. What were they actually speaking against Zipporah, or were they actually speaking against Moshe, trying to encourage him to return to his marriage, which he had abandoned? Be that as it may, Miriam gets Sara'at, Aharon goes unpunished. There's a lot to be said there. And Miriam ends up having to quarantine, something that we are all quite familiar with these days, for 7 days. The people do not move until she reemerges and enters the camp. And there's the very famous liturgical line, Ana Elna Rifana La. That's the prayer that Moshe speaks to Hashem. Oh God, please heal her now. Ana Elna Rifana La, which we say very often as a healing prayer. And that ends our parasha. So we are going to be focusing today on, we are going to be focusing today on the 9th chapter, the first 14 verses of the 9th chapter of the book of Numbers, which is about something called Pesach Sheni, which actually was rather recent, calendarically speaking. And what's interesting here, as has been pointed out by commentators in the past, the book of Numbers is a book in which there's a lot of law and narrative that are combined together. So in Vayikra, in the book of Leviticus, we had a lot of law. We had very little narrative. We had a lot of prescription and not a lot of agada or narrative. In the book of Exodus, we also get a fair amount of law and narrative combined together. But I think in the book of Numbers, we see this happening fairly frequently. We'll see it again in next week's parasha in Shlach Lecha. We'll see it throughout the rest of the Sefer. So in our particular episode today, which I will invite someone to read in the English in just a moment, we are given first and foremost the law of the Pesach sacrifice, which we've gotten in Shemot already, but we get it here again. In the second year after our exodus from Egypt, we are told that on the 14th of Nisan at twilight, we are to offer the Pesach sacrifice. And in Shemot, in Exodus 12, we get a whole description of how we do this and how families come together and how we have to be ready to go at any moment because we are waiting for that Exodus. But here in Numbers, this is something that we do as a remembrance, as a Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim, and we do it in a particular way at a particular time. So we will look at the text inside in just a moment, but immediately after receiving instructions about the Pesach sacrifice, we have some folks in the congregation of Bnei Israel coming forward to Moshe and saying, Moshe, we really want to be part of this, but we have what's called Tumat Mate. We are impure ritually due to having contact with the dead, due to having contact with a corpse. Now, what is Tumat Mate? It is understood that today we all have Tumat Mate. Kohanim are supposed to avoid this at all costs. That's why a lot of Kohanim don't go to funerals and don't go to cemeteries. But Tum'ah is ritual impurity, which is a terrible English translation because of what it implies. It's simply about not being in a ritual state, in a ritually fit state to enter the Mishkan. And there is a process for re-entry. We can think about this as liminality and then coming back into community, or as the anthropologist Victor Turner calls it, liminality and communitas. But this idea of when we have encountered death, there is a particular way in which we are ritually outside of the camp. This is not a moral judgment. I want to be very clear about this. This has nothing to do with moral judgment. That's why the idea of impurity as an English translation is very problematic, because we're not actually making a moral judgment. We could argue that later tradition might in certain cases, but if we're thinking about the pshat or the simple meaning of the text, Tumat Mate is simply about having come into contact with death, which, given that there were so many Jews traveling in the desert, there's no way that you could avoid Tumat Mate. I mean, that's just a part of life. And today, many of us, although this is less true because we've been through a global pandemic, but in years past, many people might have argued, well, a lot of us don't encounter death in a visceral way. That is obviously no longer the case for many, many people. And so I think we can understand what it means to then encounter death in a very raw way as a natural part of the human lifespan and process, even when it comes about in really awful, tragic ways. And how do you re-enter the camp? But that is all background to say that because they were in a state of Tumat Mate, they were not able to offer the Paschal offering. And they said to Moshe, well, what do we do? What do we do? And I want to pause there before giving away the ending. And I want to invite, if there's someone who could read, we're going to be looking only at the first 14 verses, but I really want to focus on the first 8 or 9 verses of chapter 9 of the book of Numbers. And I'm wondering if I have anyone who is available to read. Julie, I will defer to you.
Yes, we actually have 2 volunteers, so we'll start with Mackenzie, and I'll do a screen share of the text, and then if we need another reader, we have Ayala. So let me get this text up on the screen. All right, Mackenzie, go ahead. Thank you.
Starting with verse 1. Thank you so much.
And forgive me, in this audience, how should I say or not say first name?
Yeah, so sorry. So God's name is spelled out here and not translated. You can say God, I think.
I can't say God here. Okay, thank you.
Oh, yeah.
I appreciate that. God spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai on the first new moon of the second year following the Exodus from the land of Egypt, saying, "Let the Israelite people offer the Passover sacrifice at its set time. You shall offer it on the 14th day of this month at twilight at its set time. You shall offer it in accordance with all its rules and rites." Moses instructed the Israelites to offer the Passover sacrifices. And they offered the Passover sacrifice in the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai, just as God had commanded Moses, so the Israelites did. But there were some householders who were impure by reason of a corpse and could not offer the Passover sacrifice on that day. Appearing that same day before Moses and Aaron, those householders said to them, "Impure though we are by reason of a corpse, why must we be disbarred from presenting God's offerings at its set time with the rest of the Israelites?" Moses said to them, "Stand by and let me hear what instructions God gives about you." And God spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people, saying, when any party, whether you or your posterity, who is defiled by a corpse or is on a long journey would offer a Passover sacrifice to God, they shall offer it in the second month on the 14th day of the month at twilight. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, and they shall not leave any of it over until morning. They shall not break a bone of it. They shall offer it in a strict accord with the law of the Passover sacrifice. But if any party who is pure and not on a journey refrains from offering the Passover sacrifice, that person shall be cut off from kin. For God's offering was not presented at its set time. That party shall bear the guilt. And when a stranger who resides with you would offer a Passover sacrifice to God, it must be offered in accordance with the rules and rites of the Passover sacrifice. There shall be one law for you, whether stranger or citizen of the country.
Wonderful, Mackenzie. Thank you so much for such a beautiful reading. We're going to pause there. We're just going to be focusing on that section of the text. Thank you so much for reading that for all of us so beautifully. So we've got a couple of different themes happening here. We have Hashem reminding Bnei Israel of the Pesach sacrifice in the first month in the second year, of the wandering, which is interesting. We've got, again, folks coming in and saying to Moshe, but we are in a place of tumat meit. We want to offer the sacrifice. What are we going to do? And Moses takes it to God and says, what do we do? You might be thinking in this moment, oh, there's another story in this book of Numbers in which Moses takes something to God. And you would be correct, that is Benot Zelchad. We're not going to be going there today, but it is one of my favorite texts, and it might ring out a little bit in the fact that Moses is bringing this to God because Moses doesn't actually know what to do. And I think that in and of itself is really significant, that Moses is trying to figure out, what do we do? These folks really want to participate in this incredibly important piece of the Israelite story and how we identify ourselves. And so we've got two distinctive and boundaried, I would argue, cases. The first case is if you are in a state of tum'ah, you can offer the Pesach sacrifice on the 14th of Iyar at twilight, Bein Harbaim, just as you would have on the 14th of Nisan, and just as we do. Why do we have the Hillel sandwich, Zecher Hamikdash, and also Zecher the sacrifice, right? So what do we do with our Hillel sandwich on Seder night, which is the 15th? We'll talk about this in a minute. We eat that with the bitter herbs together with matzah and also with chavrosat. But that's of course not mentioned here, but that's what we do in our practice. And in this case, they of course are eating their sacrifice with the bitter herbs and the matzah. We of course do not offer the sacrifice anymore. And so the second case is if you are on a long journey. Now, what does it mean to be on a long journey? Does it physically only mean I'm physically far away from the Mishkan, or I'm physically far away from the temple and I can't get there? Or is this a spiritual journey? Am I spiritually disconnected and I need to return spiritually? That I think is an open question. My read of the Pshat is that we're talking only about a physical distance, but I think it is entirely possible to read this as also thinking and talking about a spiritual distance as well. And we also have here in the text very clearly delineated that if you are someone who is not on a long journey, or if you are someone who is not in a state of tum'ah and you miss the opportunity on the 14th of Nisan to make the Pesach sacrifice, you can't make it up in ER, right? Because the Pesach sacrifice is so incredibly important to who we are as a people. It's foundational. Everything we do ultimately goes back to Pesach. If we think about it's Friday, and many of us are in different time zones, but if Shabbat has not yet come in, and you're planning to make Kiddush tonight, what do we say in the Friday evening Kiddush? Zecher l'tziat Mitzrayim, right? The Kiddush for Shabbat is a Zecher l'tziat Mitzrayim. As a Kiddush for every holiday is a Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim, and therefore, this is not something that we take lightly. So if you are in a position where you could actually offer the Paschal sacrifice, the Pesach sacrifice, and you just don't, well, then you don't have the option to make it up. If you fall into this other category, though, then yes, you absolutely have this option of returning a month later and following the prescribed instructions and making the sacrifice. And I think that there's something really interesting about that. That on the one hand, this is all about second chances, and on the other, it's about boundary setting as well. Right? We don't say, for example, well, I missed Yom Kippur, so I think on the 10th of Mar Cheshvan, I will observe Yom Kippur. Or, Sukkot it's cold. I think I'm going to wait until the spring for Sukkot. Now, some of us, if you're in Australia, you do have Sukkot in the spring, but those of us who have it in the fall, right? We don't say that for Sukkot. So why do we say that for Pesach? I think it has to do with the fact that Pesach is the foundation of everything else, the foundation of every other Chag we have, the foundation of every Shabbat is about creation, ultimately, Shabbat being the time that we rest after the 6 days of creation, but we do have Shamor and Zachor, right? We remember Shabbat, we remember the Exodus from Egypt, and we keep Shabbat, we guard Shabbat because of creation, and at the same time as all of that, though Shabbat exists, irregardless of whether or not we keep it. That's an interesting liturgical note that in the prayers for Shabbat, we say Mekadesh HaShabbat, Baruch Hashem, Mekadesh HaShabbat, as opposed to the prayers for every other Chag, where we say Mekadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanim, because we make a distinction. Shabbat exists in the world. We ultimately determine, or I shouldn't say we determine, but we bring into being the holidays by our observance of them. In other words, even though Shabbat, by Jewish understanding, just exists by virtue of the fact that it's the seventh day of the week, without the Exodus, we would not be keeping Shabbat in the way that we are. We would not be experiencing it in the way that we are. The Exodus ultimately grounds everything. That's why the sacrifice is so important. And I want to make a quick note about the sacrifice, and then I want to open it up to conversation. So in the Torah, there are actually two distinct holidays that relate to Pesach. There's Chag HaPesach, which is at twilight on the 14th of Nisan, that is what we are referring to right now. Chag HaPesach is the offering of the Pesach sacrifice. Chag HaMatzot, which is what we call Pesach today. We use those terms interchangeably. But Chag HaMatzot is from the 15th through the 21st in the Torah. Some of us keep it through the 22nd. And during that time, we refrain from eating all chametz. We eat matzah traditionally. We rid our houses of chametz. This was not so long ago, so some of us might be remembering. And they are deeply interconnected in terms of how we observe them. They're literally one right after the other. But the Chag HaMatzot is about renewal, about getting rid of the grain, about remembering our leaving Egypt, because of course we left the Chifa zone. We didn't have time to pack food for the way. But that is slightly separate from Chag HaPesach, even though they are intimately connected. And of course we call Pesach today Chag HaMatzot. So in the Pesach liturgy, in the traditional liturgy, Pesach is referred to as Chag HaMatzot Zman Chirutenu, the time of our freedom. But Chag HaPesach is what the Torah is referring to now, which is the time of the offering of this sacrifice, which is the foundation for everything else. At least that is how I perceive it. And so the opportunity to offer it a month later, because of an inability to do so at the prescribed time, I think is very significant. And I think it's equally significant that this doesn't apply across the board. It's made clear very explicitly in the Torah that if you just forgot, you don't have you can't just be like, oh, I forgot on the 14th of Nisan, I was so busy running around, cleaning for Pesach, I just forgot to offer the Pesach sacrifice. You don't then get to come back a month later. This is about being literally unable to do so. And so part of it is about our responsibility to upholding the tradition, and part of it is also about the flexibility of the tradition. I think also the fact that there is one law for the Ezrach, for the citizen, and for the stranger is extremely important here, because we might have thought, well, Pesach is all about the Jewish people. Pesach is all about our national story. Pesach is about us coming together as a people and being created a people moving out of slavery into this new chapter of freedom and figuring out what does it mean? And what does it mean to be a people? But in fact, the Torah here reminds us, if there is a ger toshav, if there is someone who is dwelling with you, who is not a part of the Israelite community. So ger in this context, we often think of ger as convert today, but ger in this context has to do with somebody who is not part of the Jewish community, but is living amongst the Jewish community, and in such is offered the opportunity alongside the community to offer the Pesach sacrifice. And I think that itself is also extremely important. I'm going to pause there. I want to give us a moment to open it up to some conversation. What strikes you? What questions do you have? What emerges for you from this?
Folks can use the raise hand function, and I can get you unmuted for the conversation. I see Esther is raising a hand. Go ahead, Esther.
First of all, there are two things about Pesach Sheni. To me, first of all, it's a question of a second chance. And the second part, which I find very interesting, is that it's not just for now, but it talks about the future too. So it's not a one-time chance that God gives you. It says, you ledorotecha, so you can do it in the future too. And then you talked about the tameh. To me, we have a soul and we have a body. And the moment the soul leaves the body has no more chances to do tshuva or to do anything good. And this is why I think we call it tameh. Because it's the absence of the soul. And then something struck me because I think of the prayer. You talked in the beginning at El Nab, and Moses prays to God. And it's always, before we ask God for something, we say something nice, please. El Nab, please.
Yeah, thank you, Esther, for all of that. I'm sorry, I did not mean to jump in. Thank you for sharing all of that. Certainly, Pesach Sheni is something that can be done in the future as well, right? That this is not, it's not as though this only happens in the first year after the Exodus, that this is something that we observe today, actually. And some people have the custom on Pesach Sheni to actually eat a piece of matzah as a remembrance. In a lot of Hasidic thinking, there's a lot of emphasis on second chances, on tshuva, as you mentioned, on return. What does it mean to be able to return? And it relates also to this idea of a spiritually long journey. What happens if you are physically close, but spiritually quite distant? How do you return then? And yes, I love what you said about El Marafan Allah as well. We're not going to be talking so much about that prayer today, but it is beautiful. And there are lots of renditions of it, and if anyone is going to be in shul virtually or in person over Shabbat, you might hear that prayer in the healing prayer. So it's absolutely beautiful.
Cheryl.
Something that one reason why we get a second chance at Pesach, where we don't get a second chance at other holidays, is that we're all told that we all stood at Sinai. And Pesach is remembering that we stood at Sinai and that we went through the Exodus in order to be able to stand at Sinai. And the other holidays don't recall such an important event. Shavuot, the harvest, yeah, so what? We have a harvest every year. Purim remembers a time when the Jews were threatened and we won. Well, there were so many times the Jews were threatened and we won. Let's eat. There's a joke about that. You talked about Yom Kippur and how we wouldn't expect to redo that a month later if we missed it. So Pesach is the only holiday that remembers an event that was so important in our history that we are told that all of us, no matter where we are in history, all of us were there.
Thank you, Cheryl. I greatly appreciate you sharing all of that. I would make one minor reframe, which is that you're absolutely correct that Pesach is a chag that commemorates perhaps the most important historical and really not even historical, but lived experience of the Jewish people, because we're told every year in Pesach that we are meant to, we were all a part of the Exodus, and that we are to see ourselves ki'ilu we went out of Mitzrayim. That is one of the most important parts of the Haggadah. We say it every year. It's actually found in Mishnah Pesachim, chapter 10, Mishnah 5. It's so important that we are to live that out every year, that the Seder is not just a reenactment, it's actually a lived experience. Shavuot, so we go to Pesach, we have Pesach, and we're journeying. And we get to Shavuot and we stand at Sinai. That is how the rabbis understand Shavuot, is this time of revelation. That is when we get to Sinai and receive the Torah. Pesach is the time when we are leaving our narrowness, our narrow places, we're leaving enslavement, we are moving into becoming a free people, figuring out what does freedom even mean? And we get to Shavuot and we receive Torah. So they're deeply, intimately connected. But I think that the reason that we are allowed or able to make up the Pesach sacrifice is exactly what you were saying about the importance of Pesach historically and for the national consciousness, right? If we were all part of the Exodus, although there is some question around did all the Israelites leave or not, but we're going to leave that aside for today. But certainly there is this idea that we are to remember every year that we went out of Egypt. So thank you very much for sharing that. And I would love to hear from a few other folks.
Noreen.
I think, isn't Pesach the only holiday that's where you can be cut off if you don't celebrate it? So it's a kind of have to situation.
Yom Kippur as well.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yom Kippur as well. Yes, but those are the two big ones that if you don't keep them, that yes, the idea of being cut off. I like to think of that less as a punitive thing and more as a spiritual thing. Like if, you know, and this is, I want to make a major disclaimer that Yom Kippur in particular, actually both Pesach and Yom Kippur, both Pesach and Yom Kippur have dietary restrictions. Yom Kippur, traditionally we fast, although it doesn't actually say we have to do that in the Torah directly. In the Torah, it just talks about afflicting our souls. That has become fasting. And Pesach, we refrain from chametz. And there are many people in our community for whom, for any number of reasons, those are acts that are dangerous to the body. And Judaism is extremely clear, and you can even look in Masachet Yoma, in the tractate of Yoma on Yom Kippur about this. Judaism is extremely clear that we are to preserve our life above everything else. So if we think about Yom Kippur and we think about the fasting, if one is not able to fast, one must eat to preserve one's life. So there are lots of ways we think about Yom Kippur, but the reason I bring that in is because when we talk about being cut off related to Pesach and Yom Kippur, I think we need to be very sensitive to what do we mean by that in our day? What was the Torah talking about in its context? What are we talking about in ours? And how do we make sure that we build communities and that we build observances that allow people to engage and to have deeply meaningful experiences, even and especially if they are not able to partake in some of the more central rituals, whether that is refraining from eating or whether that is making major dietary adjustments. But yes.
Okay, Mackenzie, and then Joanne.
Yeah, I have a question. It's interesting to me that it being defiled by a corpse or someone on a long journey are paired together, especially if I think about in this context, would people really be, if they're all traveling together, would people really be going on long journeys much? I'm curious, like what would prompt that to be the pairing for consideration within the context of the people and the text at this time, if you could speak to that at all.
Yeah, thanks, Mackenzie. I think that is such an interesting pairing, right? Because we don't get any notice about the long journey until, as you were so beautifully reading for us, right? God says to Moses, okay, people can offer this Pesach Sheni in the case of being on a long journey. And you're like, huh, where did that come from?
Yeah.
I imagine several things, and I don't claim to have the perfect answer here, but there are a couple of things that I imagine related to this. One of them, if we think about the Mishkan as the center, as the locus, that ultimately becomes the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, the first and the second. But if we think about the Mishkan as the center, let's think about the future, as Esther was talking to us about a little bit earlier. Pesach Sheni is something that can be done in the future, right? This is an ongoing hope. This is an ongoing law. So if you think ahead, many years, you might think to yourself, well, okay, it's the 12th of Nisan, and I was planning on making the pilgrimage because Pesach is a pilgrimage festival. I was planning on making the pilgrimage, but there was really bad weather in the place that I was coming from, right? The rainy season hasn't yet started in the land of Israel, but Jews were living in Bavel and other places, and let's say they were journeying to the land of Israel to go to Yerushalayim, to go to the temple. And they're trying to get there and they're journeying and they realize like, oh, I'm not gonna make it. Okay, I am physically distanced from Yerushalayim. I am on a long journey. I am coming a long ways away. Think about, of course, the fact that transportation was very different when people actually made pilgrimage on the three pilgrimage festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And That may be what's being referred to, physically being distanced. That is what I imagine. I imagine that if we think about the simple meaning of the text, what we're actually talking about here is someone was not able to go to Yerushalayim, it says in Deuteronomy later on, to be with Hashem and to be seen by Hashem in a metaphorical way. They could then, when they get there in ER, they can then make that offering. Why is that paired with Tumat Mate? I think also there is a journey that happens when we lose a loved one, right? I think about this in a bit more of a spiritual way. When we lose someone close to us, and death, of course, is very much a part of our experience as human beings, and all the more so before things became much more distanced from us. I could imagine a scenario in which someone is in a place of mourning, in a place of grieving, in a place of re-entry, and that may account for why these two things are paired together.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Joanne, go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi. I am very moved this morning by the way that you brought us to the combination of Shamor and Zachor together, that the keeping or the guarding and the being combined with remembering. And I feel like when we look at Pesach, it is by far and away the holiday with the most preparation.
Mm-hmm.
While there's a certain preparation weekly for Shabbos, it has a kind of gentle cadence, whereas Pesach is like such a big to-do. And I believe that what you put the light on for us today about how one identifies, combined with setting a boundary, that if you can, you must. But if you truly cannot, don't worry, here comes your second chance. And for myself and throughout Torah, I discover again and again that much of the time the cannot, with regard to combining Shamor v'Zachor, is around what one experiences when someone dies. That memory itself is so confusing when we are grieving that it really is impossible to do all of the preparation to be spiritually present.
Yeah, that is beautiful. And what I want to say in response to that is that as you noted, the Torah really makes that clear. I mean, even in the laws of mourning, there is a concept. So once someone close to you has died, you automatically enter a state where you are not obligated in any ritual action whatsoever. And you are in that state until burial and then through Shiva. You are not obligated in anything. You are so focused on making arrangements for the burial, making arrangements for the funeral, and grieving and memory being so confusing, as you noted, that there's nothing else to do. There's literally nothing one can do but focus entirely on that. And then you can come back into the other things later. But our tradition understands that grieving requires stopping immediately. Our culture, I know that we're a global audience, but I would say in general, secular culture and non-Jewish culture, not all of it, but a good number of it, doesn't understand that in the same way. There are plenty of other traditions that have deep mourning practices. And I think that there's a large conversation that we can have another time about the ways in which we don't do grief well as a culture. But I think that is all to say that there is something that the Torah understands. There's something that we understand about how we need to pause. And as you said about the grieving, right, I think here with Pesach Sheni, there is an understanding. I am in deep grief. I've lost this person. You're now expecting me to go slaughter a lamb, put it all together with the bitter herbs and make sure I've got enough matzah, and then offer it at a very prescribed time. And that's the other thing about Pesach. Pesach, unlike most of the holidays, although time is very important in Judaism, but Pesach, not only does it have the most preparation, but it also, the actual sacrifice has to be offered at a very particular time on the 14th of Nisan, just as the day is beginning, because our days begin in the evening. At twilight, we have to offer it immediately, right? And that is key. Right before we go into the 15th, we offer it, and right at twilight on the 14th of Nisan, I misspoke there. What I meant to say was the twilight of Nisan being the last moments of the day, but we offer it right then and there, and we then move into the Seder on the 15th, but we have to offer the sacrifice at the proper time, and we cannot leave it until morning. So if you are in a place where that is just not a possibility, there is an understanding that you have an opportunity to come back and make it up at a different time. And with that, we are almost at time, so I'm going to turn it back over to Julie. Thank you all so much for being here and for learning together.